that the technology itself was really advanced. It was a kind of combination um, ramjet plus a rocket engine combination, which is a very unusual combination. What that means is that the entire Silver Bird could essentially fly through the air and then eventually into outer space. Usually we separate those two things out. Airplanes fly in the air, rockets fly in outer space, and so forth. So that combination was very unique. But the other part, and probably the part that attracted the interest of the Nazis, was the fact that this thing could potentially fly across the ocean. So it was really, and as military planners and so forth, they were thinking that this is something that we could probably use for, battle conditions and things like that. So yeah. So I think both of those, technologically, it was breaking a frontier. And on the other side, once it was imagined, you could imagine it as a very lethal weapon in wartime. So, there's weirdly and strangely, the the research on what we call scramjets are still, sort of really at the cutting edge of our advanced aerospace technology. And now we're beginning to see, I think in the last 10, 15 years, that possibility really emerging um, as a realistic possibility, not, particularly weapon systems that we have heard about recently. Um, but I do think that it's not for lack of imagination or trying. In fact, the British government were in talks through the 1980s for something called the HOTOL, HOTOL, which is a fascinating sort of child, if you will, of the thinking of the Silver Bird. But I think now one might imagine somebody or some company or some government perhaps trying to put something together. Its time has arrived, I think, if you will, in some sense, yeah. Let's presume that the Nazis had been able to do it, which, this is really ahead of its time. Sanger and his partner, Irene, was not so talked about, but although she had quite a big part in conceptualizing it, but in those days, the man usually got the credit. So Eugene and Irene, the thing that they produced was really ahead of its time. This is the 1930s. But I think if the Nazis had had a certain kind of technologies to build this thing, one of the biggest challenges was, in fact, cooling, because this system essentially, when it operated, got so hot that you needed something to cool it with, to bring it down into normal temperatures. And one of Sanger's innovations was to use the actual fuel once it's used, to pass it through and around the engine to cool it. And so these kinds of things were very technologically advanced, but not necessarily, I think, one could imagine the Nazis, let's say they did it. I think that would have certainly changed the outcome of the war, because one can imagine the Nazis launching a Silver Bird towards New York. And, one of the things I wrote about was New York was one of its principal targets. I do think that that's very an unlikely scenario that the Nazis would have developed it. However, it's entirely plausible in the 40s and 50s, if there was a national project, let's say in the United States and Soviet Union, or even in Western Europe, one can imagine something like that happening. I think the implications actually were quite significant for the civilian, for us, really, regular people, to imagine something that really shortens the time travel from New York to London and so forth. Of course, later on, we had the Concorde. But it's sort of the Silver Bird is like several orders faster and more sort of going at lightning speed, really, if you will. So I think it might have revolutionized civilian air travel, if it had come around in the 50s and 60s. And that's sort of, those are two alternative world scenarios. One is fundamentally a shift in the war, World War II. Number two, a shift in the way we fly, and perhaps even an effect on the Cold War itself. I think I wrote about, or if you remember, I wrote about in the piece that the Soviets tried to build it on the other side, but they couldn't, and they gave up pretty soon. And they tried to kidnap Eugene Sanger, and I can talk about that. But yeah, they made a big push for it. They realized they couldn't do it, and they abandoned it. But in the US, there were similar kinds of murmurs. Can we do this? And very early on, there was a clear sense that this is probably not doable now. it's one of those things that didn't come to fruition, but has had more value as an inspiration. And I think if you open up any book on the space shuttle or things like that, it's really interesting how chapter one is always about the Silverbird, because that's sort of ground zero. It's really the first, or one of the first times, that people are beginning to think of what we might call as a space plane, something that takes off from the ground, goes into outer space. Not like the ones we see usually in the space program with a vertical rocket that has a little capsule at the top and they sort of go into space and come back. So the Sanger and Brett's contribution was, I think, one of the most potent forms of inspiration to think about a space plane. And this was very much in the discourse in the 60s and 70s. And I don't think it's an overstatement to say that NASA decided to build a space shuttle, that decision was taken in the early 70s, that the people who were thinking about the space shuttle were deeply influenced by the Silverbird because they'd grown up looking at drawings and pictures of this. So I think as an inspiration, it was crucial to the building of the space shuttle, which then becomes real and becomes a real NASA project. But I think even today, it's, if you pick up popular space journals, I'm actually struck by how often there's a little aside on the Silverbird and what it was, and because it's still this sort of it's a perfect example of a future that might have been, which I think we're very much captivated by those nostalgic sort of for the future, really. So I think in that way, it's very much remains as an inspiration.